Thessalonians is one of the earlier letters of Paul to the church that he spent, some scholars say 2.5 years, some say 3, some say 2 years. So he knows that community. And if you notice the works of Paul, one of the issues that you're dealing with is this kind of tension they were feeling between having been a part of this proclamation that the end times were coming, that the day of the Lord was coming soon, which means, that Jesus would return, or that the rapture, or whatever we want to call it, using Revelation terminology, which is not Thessalonians terminology, that it was coming, and how do we live in this meantime? And they expected it any moment. But then you read other letters of Paul which were written later in his ministry, Romans for instance, and there's very little reference to an anticipation of the second coming, because obviously after a number of years people began to wonder, well, he hasn't come back yet. So in Thessalonians he's dealing with this tension, but even in the middle of that tension he's calling them to be the people of God. In a waiting pose perhaps, but not a passive waiting, an active waiting. That even as you wait for this time, which we're going to talk about next week a little bit more, by the way, even as you wait, be the body of Christ. And the reading Carolyn read is really the Spirit of God talking through Paul saying, be thankful, give thanks in all circumstances. And that's what I want to focus on today, this giving thanks in all circumstances. Because sometimes that seems a little hard to do, isn't it? In all circumstances. Now, we notice it doesn't say give thanks for everything. It says in everything, the Scriptures say. And that is hard to do. Especially if we pay attention to the news. And fill our lives with what's going on in the world and difficult things. Sometimes it's hard to do that. I know, how many of you have kids that are grown up? Ooh, wow. How many have kids that are still growing up? Young kids? All right. I know when my kids were young, whenever someone did nice to them, something nice to them, or a gift, or gave something to them, or gave them a compliment, what did you tell, or what do you tell your kids to do, right? Say, right? And why do you do that? Because it's being nice, right? It's making sure they have good, and maybe having good manners will grease the skids of social conventions, right? Maybe their teachers might predispose to them a little bit more because they have good manners, or your neighbors will think more of you rather than less of you because your children have good manners. But is that really why we teach our children as people of faith to say thank you? Isn't there more to it than that? Can you make someone thankful? What do you think? Can you make someone thankful? No. I think it's yes, and I think it's no. Always splitting that hair, It's yes and no. There's been some interesting research on gratitude I discovered. Sean Anker wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage. He spent 12 years studying and has been studying happiness and gratitude. And he discovered some interesting things. He said that we are 10 times more likely to notice the negative things in our world than we are the positive things in our world. He said that we teach our brain when we do that behavior does not matter. That any good day could just be robbing you from whatever you have been given. He cited a study. Get this. That said that if you watch 3 minutes of negative news in the morning, that the people in the study 6 to 8 hours later unfailingly reported having a mostly negative day. But if they watched positive news in the morning, unfortunately, he said they had to watch 3 hours of positive news in the morning to come out of that same experience saying they had a good day. There's something about us predisposed to seeing the hole in the donut sometimes, I think. But I think what he's pointing out is 3 minutes of negative news can change your whole day. And I look at my life and I know what I watch in the morning to catch up on what's happening in the world, and I ask myself, I wonder if that's influencing my day. Here's another thing they discovered in research. Sometimes we think that our disposition towards being optimist or pessimist is either DNA, right? It's nature or nurture, right? It's your DNA or it's your circumstances, right? Well, their studies showed this, that even a family that had children whose DNA came out of that family was predisposed to be pessimism, that if they spent 2 minutes a night around the dinner table and asked those children to recite 3 things that they were grateful for in the last 24 hours, that if they did it for 21 days, the orientation of those children would change from negativism to optimism. He says we can rewire our brains towards gratitude. Isn't that something? And not only in children, they did this with 84-year-old men. And they discovered when they practiced the same thing with 84-year-old men, they could overcome, dig this, 8 decades of life experience and create more optimistic men. So as you're sitting around and menus or something with your optimistic old men or your children, practice that. I thought, I'm going to talk to my dad about that. Think about that. We can rewire our brains towards optimism. And there are research and studies that shows that we can actually do that. Give thanks in all things. Paul writes, just 2 minutes a day rewires your brain. And I think developing a life of gratitude also enables us to hold life a little more lightly, because I think sometimes we live in a world in which we think there's only so much. There's only so many jobs, and there's only so much money, and there's only so much love, and there's only so much joy. And if I don't get a hold of mine, then I'm not going to get what I should be getting. And we get governed by a sense of entitlement or grievance. And I think we lose the scriptural basis for gratitude. We lose this understanding that God is not a God who's withholding good things in our lives in order to punish us and teach us how to really be thankful. God is a God of gratitude and generosity. God made the heavens and the earth. God gave you skills and gifts in order to make a living and to provide for yourselves and for your family. And lo and behold, there's even some left over for those who need it. God doesn't withhold. God gives generously. And I know I've grown up in some congregations and ways of looking at God that seem to see God as kind of this withholder or benevolent kind of dictator in some way, but that is not who God is. If you look at the scriptures, God is generous. The early Hebrews in Psalm 136, there are 26 verses. I won't read them all. But here's what they style. They say, first one, give thanks to the Lord because God is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the greatest of all gods. And back then they lived in a culture of fighting with other cultures who had their own gods. And we think that's ancient stuff. But hey, we got gods in our lives too sometimes, don't we? Things that take more attention than our God. Give thanks to the greatest of all gods. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the mightiest of all lords. His love endures forever. For He led us, people of Israel, out of Egypt. His love endures forever. He led His people through the desert. His love endures forever. He did not forget us when we were defeated. His love endures forever. He freed us from our enemies. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of heaven. His love endures forever. That's right. Give thanks to the God of heaven. His love endures forever. All right. I like it. That's not a people who think, God may be generous on a whim. That's a people who have experienced a transforming, generous, life-giving love of God. And we forget that in this culture. We are trained sometimes, I think, to forget that. Give your heart. Make your choice to trust the goodness of God. And watch how it begins to change your life. Can we make someone thankful? Well, we first did the yes part. We can literally rewire our brains. God has made us for gratitude in some ways, and we can rewire for that. But there's also a no to being able to be thankful too, I think. I think that the no is this. At some point, we all have to choose to be grateful and thankful for ourselves. Don't we? We all have to make that choice. Whether it's around the dinner table or in our prayer times at night. That's a choice we all need to make. Paul doesn't write, give thanks when you feel like it, right? Paul says, give thanks in all circumstances. And I think what he's driving at in the heart of gratitude is not what experience you're having right now that makes you gratitude. It's a desire and a choose to be the person you want to be. I think what Jesus was saying when Jesus talked about where your treasure is, there your heart is also, right? And usually we hear that and we think, well, where your heart is, that's where your treasure is going to fall. Like when you get really attracted to those PBS, ads for support. Well, you love PBS, so you're going to spend your treasure where your heart is, right? Or maybe your heart is on a really nice car, an expensive car, and so you spend a lot of money on that expensive car, and guess where your heart's going to go? Or maybe I got to have the best looking house on the block. And you spend good money in order to make that real. But what happens to your heart? What if your desire, the person you want to be, the person you want to become is a person of faith? It's a follower of Christ. If that's where your heart is, if that's where your joy is, if that's where you know that's who you want to be, then Jesus says what you want to be and become is really where your treasure. That's not what Jesus says, but that's where your treasure is going to flow. What Jesus is saying, though, is something different. We talked about this 3 weeks ago. He's saying, invest in what you want to become, and your heart will follow. Invest in the person you want to be and become, and your heart will follow. It's a different dynamic. Give to where you want your heart to be. Give and your heart will follow. And it's not about feeling. It's about just do it. It's about just do it. Research shows we can become more grateful. And sometimes we also have to ask that question, who is it I want to be? Who do I want my family to be? What kind of person do I want to be? What values do I want to see lived out in my life? What are the core values that matter and have most to me? Is it following God or something else? And so when I write down my commitment card, I love this time of year because I get to write down my commitment card when I feel God is calling me to give. And that's the exact question I found myself asking this year is making sure that I'm moving my treasure where I want my heart to go. Even in a deeper way. John Kralik wrote a book called 365 Thank Yous. It's actually been retitled since then, entitled A Simple Act of Gratitude, How Learning to Say Thank You Changed His Life. Now, he was in a tailspin in his life. His practice, he's a lawyer, was losing money. He was losing clients. He was losing his office that they were living in. He was paying 3 mortgages. His first wives, his second wives, and his sons. He was overweight. He was out of shape. He had health problems. He was working 14 to 18 hours a day. He was worried about losing most of the money he had earned after his first divorce because of his second divorce. And he was depressed. He would sometimes say, I wish he could be like the people who had heart attacks. Not because he wanted to die, because he thought to himself, if I just had 3 or 4 days in the hospital, I didn't have to worry about work, then I would be okay. One day in this place, he goes for a walk in the hills outside of Pasadena, California, in one of those trails in the woods, and He took a couple of bad turns, and as he's walking, he hears this voice in his lostness in the woods. The voice says this. It says, until you are grateful for the things you have, you will not receive what you want. The voice said, until you are grateful for the things you have, you will not receive what you want. Well, he pondered that for a minute. He says, I don't really have much to be grateful for anyway. But then an idea came for him. He said, you know what? I think for every day in the next year, for 365 days, I'm going to write a thank you note to people in my life, people I've known, to the barista at Starbucks who remembered his name. And he did it. It turned out to take him about 18 months instead of 365 days. But here's what he learned by taking time to write a thank you note every day. He said he realized it calmed him down. He said in all the negativity in his life, it felt like in doing that he was making a small difference. It allowed him to remember things that people had done for him in his life or were doing for him. He was able to reconnect with old friends, and he found that his focus was shifting from the painful reversals of his life to the many friends and resources in his life, and he started to feel better about himself. And the simple act of writing a thank you opened his eyes to other gifts in his life. And here's what he learned. He learned that the hatred he had in his heart for others and circumstances, that's what was destroying him, not the hatred he felt he was getting from others. It calmed him. And he writes near the end of this book, he said, if that voice that I heard in the mountains had implied that I would get everything he wanted, he said, and after a year and a half, then that is a promise that has not been fulfilled. But he said, I have realized this, that being thankful for what he had, he realized he had everything he needed. And being thankful for what he had, he realized he had everything he needed. He said, I don't know if my life radically changed. He said, but the experience of my life was transformed. See, God knows us. God knows how we're pre-wired, not culturally wired. God knows what we're made for. And when Paul says, give thanks in all circumstances, he is on to something. That in a heart and attitude of gratitude, it changes and transforms our whole world and our whole life. So how about you? What are you grateful for? We've talked about some things, but in your life. And here's what I want you to do. To take that card and write a thank you note this week to somebody. But don't let it be a family member. Tell your family. May it be someone outside of your normal zone of relationships. Someone that God just gives you a name and says, I need to write this person a thank you note. And if you're courageous enough and want to tell me how that goes, if you hear back from those people, great. But write a thank you note to someone this week outside of your normal routine. Maybe it's someone at work you don't interact with. Maybe it's someone at Dunkin' Donuts. When you drive through the drive-thru, you find out their name, and then one day you're driving through, you hang them a thank you note, and they're like, whoa. But they read it, and they're like, whoa. I am somebody. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to those that have commitment cards to come forward to lay them. While we're singing Give Thanks, I'd like everybody, whether you bring a card or not, to begin forming our circle on the outside. And to remember that these cards are really an expression of who we want to be, what we want to become, the power of God's Spirit that's working in you. See, you can be a thankful person. And when you do, it changes things.